In this video, I'm going to talk about the Council of Nicaea. It is the first ecumenical council of the church, and the major issue is the very nature of Christ. All right, so let's look at Origen again for a second. If you recall, Origen was important in establishing original doctrines of the church through writings and such. Origen spoke of Jesus as being of the same substance as the Father. He also said that the Son was eternally begotten. Okay, this should be pretty familiar language to you. So, while setting a precedent for how to view the relationship between Jesus and God the Father, Origen certainly did not end discussion or debate on the issue. Christians worshiped Jesus as God, but they also asserted that they were monotheists and God the Father was the same God as the God of Israel. It is no wonder people were a little confused as to the exact nature and the exact relationship of the persons of the Trinity. People are still confused, to be really honest. All right. We are going to talk about this person here, Arius. Okay. In a sense, Arianism goes back to the argument that early theologians like Origen made comparing God the Father to the God of the philosophers, who was immutable, impassible, and fixed. At the same time, Christians believed in a God who was also personal. Okay, so a way to resolve this was the Logos, word or reason of God, that the Logos is personable and capable of relationship with the world. In other words, the Logos was kind of the go-between between the immutable God and the immutable world. So then what does that make Jesus? In the words of the Arians, there was a time when he was not. All right? Jesus was not co-eternal with the Father. Jesus was the first of all creation, but he was a creature. This is the big point, all right? And this is the big point of conflict, all right? Jesus was a creature. Why is this such a big deal? Okay. For both sides of this conflict, the issue of salvation is at stake. For the Arians, Jesus opened the way to salvation by his obedience to God. And this obedience is meaningless if Jesus is actually God. For Athanasius and the other Nicene Christians, Christ achieved our salvation because in him, God entered into human history and opened the way for our return to God, okay? God actually has to do the saving. Here's this phrase, the incorruptible must become corruptible for the corruptible to become incorruptible, all right? Does that make sense? So, there is a council. Constantine wanted Christianity to be unifying, all right? And all of this inner fighting over this issue of Arianism was not welcome. He had apparently been thinking of holding an ecumenical council for a while, and this prompted him to call Nicaea, which is pretty close to Constantinople. It's actually like a resort town, or was a resort town, okay? So how many bishops came? We're not sure. Probably somewhere in the 300 range is a good estimate. The majority were from the Greek-speaking East, though there were some Western Christians as well. A brief note on the bizarreness of this entire event, okay? A number of bishops that were in attendance were actually victims of like torture and persecutions. Now the emperor was sending them on like an all-expense paid trip to a resort town to hammer out some theological issues, all right? I just want you to wrap your mind around this for a second, okay? So, at the council, there are a number of like administrative issues that needed to be addressed, procedure for readmission of lapsed Christians, kind of that whole Donatist issue, election and ordination of presbyters and bishops, standardization of the date of Easter, the books of the New Testament. These are all topics that were discussed. But the big issue is Arius and his followers. Okay, interesting. Arius was actually not allowed to sit at the council because he was not a bishop. Eusebius of Nicomedia, do not confuse him with Eusebius of Caesarea, who was actually also in attendance, spoke for Arius and his position. This was a relatively small group at the council, but they were very impassioned. Okay. There was also an opposition party, also small but also very impassioned, who were convinced that Arianism threatened the very core of Christianity. This group was led by Alexander of Alexandria. Also there, but only a deacon at the time, was Athanasius, who would eventually become synonymous with Nicene orthodoxy. Okay. Most bishops from the West only had a secondary interest in this debate. They were far more influenced by Tertullian in the West than Origen. And Tertullian had not relied on the Greek philosophers. And he, remember, actually said 3 persons, 1 substance, way before, all right, in the 100s. So there was also a very small group that believed that God the Father and Jesus were exactly the same. So God the Father had actually also suffered on the cross. They condemned Arianism, but their position was also condemned. So we'll kind of leave that group alone. Finally, the vast majority of bishops in attendance did not belong to any of these aforementioned groups. They were upset by the controversy that was dividing the church, and they wanted a compromise. So what changed? Simply put, the majority of these bishops did not truly understand the Arian position before the council. Eusebius of Nicaea explained it, expecting the bishops would hear it and support it. What actually happened was that the majority of the bishops heard the explanation and they were horrified. When Eusebius explained that Jesus was a creature, granted the best and greatest creature of all, the bishops started screaming, "You lie, blasphemy, heresy!" All right, things got real wild. This is like gone down in Christian history as fact. Apparently, Saint Nicholas, like the person that Santa Claus is based on, Saint Nick, actually punched Arius. All right, so things were heated at the Nicene Council. So instead of looking for compromise, the bishops now wanted to reject Arianism in the clearest possible way. At first, they tried to do this simply through Bible passages, and then finally decided to formulate a creed. It's not entirely sure how they got there, but Eusebius of Caesarea offered up his own church's creed. Of the same substance was added, apparently at the suggestion of the emperor, I don't know, and some other points clearly rejected Arianism were added as well. The creed in its original form and then later adapted form are on page 101 and 102 of Coakley and Stirk. Take a look at it. Once you kind of understand the background, it's fascinating to look at the creed again with fresh eyes.